My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and thrilled to be with you today for our virtual reading group. As I'm sure you all know, we are in the midst of reading The Human Condition, published in 1958. Hannah Arendt's second major work. She wrote more than one book before it, but The Origins of Totalitarianism was her first major work. And This Human Condition is her second. We are in the midst of the last of the three sort of middle sections or chapters of the book on labor, work, and action. On this chapter on action. Action, which she has said is the highest of the faculties of the vita activa, the life of action. And last week, we read at the end of our discussion last week, we read chapter we read chapter 26 on the frailty of human affairs. And I said that this chapter leads into the next few chapters. And so just a quick recap of the frailty of human affairs. The basic idea is that there are two great dangers that Arendt sees in action for our world. The first is that action is boundless. It's never a closed circle. It's a very simple idea. Action leads to more action, and it's irreversible. And insofar as action is boundless, it's also unpredictable. This is the second great danger of action. And this unpredictability and boundless leads to the predicaments of action, namely that, if you act, honestly, you may have the best intentions of the world. You may want to bring about a better world and justice. And yet, if you act, the consequences could be catastrophic. And so the predicaments of action are that, why should we act? Will we act? And do we want action? And so there's a way in which the calamities of action, I shall talk about it later in this chapter, near the end of this chapter, are real, and they lead to problems. Not the least of which is that because it's boundless and because it's unpredictable, action has very few benefits. When you act, you don't know if you're going to get anything out of it. You don't know if you're going to be successful. You don't know if you're going to be seen as a criminal or as a hero. And so there's a question of why we act, and there's a question of whether action means anything. And so these are what she calls sort of the frailties of action. And then the chapters that we read today are beginning to offer what she will call different solutions or different responses to these frailties of action. And the first chapter we read for today, chapter 20 or section 27, I'm sorry, is called the Greek solution. And the Greek solution is a complicated chapter because there's two Greek solutions that are discussed here, and she sometimes I think is maybe not as clear for those who are reading her quickly or for the first time might like. There's what she'll call the pre-political Greek solution, the solution of the Homeric Greeks and of the pre-philosophical Greeks. And that solution is the one that she describes as the polis, as the polis that provides a space of appearance where people can act and appear and thus be. And then there's the other Greek solution, which is the solution of the Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle and others, which actually tries to limit action and limit the pre-political solution, because what they see is that action is dangerous, and action leads to disorder, and action leads to revolution, and action leads to the mob. And so the philosophers try and replace action with legislation, with politics as legislation or truth. And for those of us who were with us a few months ago when we read her book, The Promise of Politics, the edited collection, and she talks about how there's a bias against politics that goes back to Plato. This is another expression of that same idea, that what Plato is actually his solution, the Platonic philosophical solution, is to try and eradicate politics and action through legislation and philosophy. So in this chapter, the basic argument is that for Plato and the philosophical Greeks, lawmakers are makers. They're not actors. They make legislation. Laws are dead things. And I'll just point out that she does offer an alternative idea of law, which she finds in Montesquieu in the last chapter on page 190, footnote 17, where she says that for Montesquieu, laws are rapport. And, you know, a rapport is a relation between people, a rapport. And it's a very radical reading of laws. But there is a way which she thinks that laws, at least in the Montesquieuian way, can be about relationships. Whereas laws as legislation, which sets what you can and can't do, are not about relationships. They're about setting rules and shutting down action. That is one part of the Greek solution, the philosophical Greek solution. The other pre-political Greek solution to the frailty of action is to make the common world of words and deeds last past man's death, to multiply the occasions for immortal fame. So insofar as we have a polis, and a polis, she says, is not the laws or the walls, it's the people. Wherever the people are, there is the polis. And the people, though, appear in a space. And as a space of organized remembrance, when people act, their actions can be remembered across generations. They act and share together. And insofar as they do, there is a solution for this frailty of action, that it disappears, that it doesn't last. And this is the sort of first solution to the problem of action, these two different Greek solutions. The next chapter 28, the next section 28 of chapter on action is about the space of appearance and power. And the basic insight here is that power is a relation that emerges between two people and their words and deeds. So those of you who've read On Violence, you'll recognize that 10 years, or no, sorry, it's 5 or 6 years before, or 7 or 8 years before she writes On Violence, she's already thought through this relation between power and violence. Power is a relation that emerges between two people and their words and deeds. And the words and deeds disclose a real and shared world to create new realities. Power, which she traces to the Greek dunamis, potentia, and the German Macht or Mögen, a moving power, inclination, is always a wanting, and even a loving. Mögen is also to like or to love. And actually, Heidegger makes a lot of this connection between power, potential, and loving in his letter on humanism, amongst other places. But this is something Arendt is developing as well. This Mugen, this loving, this moving idea of power, which comes from people acting and sharing together. It's important that here she says that power is unlimited. Power is what allows us to build a common world. And it can't be stopped by laws or rules. It can only be stopped by other powers. This is an insight she traces back to two people, Montesquieu and also John Adams. And she thinks that it is in the United States that this insight is best understood. And in her book on revolution, she argues that the constitutional structure of the United States was largely based on this insight that John Adams had from his reading of Montesquieu, that the constitutional structure of a plural country or plural polity depends upon the protection of plurality. And the protection of plurality depends upon the prevention of a single sovereign power from existing. And the only way to protect against a single sovereign power from existing is not constitutions or laws, but dividing power and multiplying power, which leads to ever greater power and competition. I'm sure this will come up in the Q&A, but I just want to emphasize how central this is to Arendt's thinking. The way to protect against tyranny or totalitarianism or even the loss of power is never to limit power. It's to multiply powers. And the real innovation that she saw as an immigrant to the United States was that in the United States, unlike other countries, there wasn't an attempt to limit powers. There was an attempt to create a structure for the coexistence of multiple powers. And that was what she saw, at least in its origin and its early years, as in her mind, the great achievement of the American political system. The danger to politics for her is the loss of power. Why? Because the loss of power means that power, which is what relates people together, has to be replaced by something else. And that something else is usually violence or force. And so violence, she says, cannot replace power. It can't substitute for it, but it can destroy power. I mean, if you want an example of how violence cannot replace power, look at Afghanistan, right? The amount of violence you bring to bear on a place, you can't, if you don't have power, if you don't have a place where people can act and build a common world by acting together, no amount of violence can build a common world. We lose power today, and this is one of her central worries and insights throughout her work. We lose power today in modern Western democracies, republics, for a number of reasons. One is we come to believe that power corrupts, and thus instead of it seeks to limit powers. And limit power, it increasingly empowers a centralized bureaucracy, which not only uses violence and force to impose its will, but is not responsible to anyone. It's what she calls the rule of nobody, and thus disempowers people who feel they no longer have the ability to make change in society. So in her essay on violence, she's going to argue, or she does argue, that the real source of violence in the modern world, the reason the world has become more and more violent and that we have glorified violence, is because we have so disempowered the people through bureaucracy that violence increasingly feels like the only way people can act. I just want to point out on page 203, I think a very insightful and yet I think probably controversial argument or point that Arendt makes quickly. That's on page 203, where she says that another way that we corrupt power is when the weak rise against the strong. Now you might think, well, that's power. The weak rises against the strong. And it can be, as long as the strong also have power. But when the weak rise against the strong and kill the strong, that's what she calls mob rule. And the problem with it is it doesn't allow the strong to continue to exist amidst a plurality of powers. It seeks to impose one power over all. And here's your Tolkien reference: one ring to control them all. And so this is something that this is an argument she also makes near the end of the chapter on the social in On Revolution. And it's one that I think is very counterintuitive for a lot of people who read her in groups like this, which is that in order for a plurality to exist, you need to have a balance of power between the rich and the poor. You can't have the rich overwhelm the poor, and you can't have the poor overwhelm the rich. She then, in this discussion of power, moves to this question of, well, if power is in action and acting together, power is in acting together, how do we judge action, right? And this is a real problem, because there are all sorts of acting togethers, right? There's the Black Lives Matter movement is acting together, but so is the MAGA movement acting together, right? There's the Warsaw Ghetto Rising acting together, and there's the Wehrmacht and the SS acting together. And she's saying that all these are actions. And she has this line which has excited and infuriated our readers of Arendt for 60 years. Action can be judged only by the criterion of greatness. What does she mean by that? She means that when somebody acts, the action is not a moral, can't be judged on moral grounds. It is not, it also can't be judged on whether it's successful or not. So Black Lives Matter can't be judged on whether it achieves change or not. That's not what makes it great or not. It can't be judged on whether it's moral or not. It also can't be judged on its motivation, a psychological motivation, because all of these things she thinks are not unique. You know, they're shared. You know, MAGA and Black Lives Matter both have motivations. They both have aims or goals. And they both can be claimed, they can claim moral or immoral. What distinguishes them for her is the performance itself, the virtuosity. The greatness is a glory, and that means that it can't be bad. It can be evil. Great acts can do evil, and the great acts can do good, but they can't be bad. They have to be of the type that when you look at them, regardless of whether you agree with them or not morally, you look at them and say, there's something extraordinary. I'm going to use a word some of you will not like: beautiful. I like to think about this as a lawyer, or as a trained lawyer. I like to think about this through the example of revenge. If you think about acts of revenge, some of them we find completely, really mean-spirited and awful. You know, somebody is hurt and they're resentful and they go on a killing spree. But then you look at something like the Count of Monte Cristo, where the Count of Monte Cristo spends years, decades planning revenge on the people who abandoned him in this prison and island. And there's a kind of virtuosity to it. And in some sense, an act of revenge well wrought is the epitome of justice. And what I think that this aesthetic element of that we can appreciate a certain kind of virtuosity in an act of revenge is to some degree what Arendt is here getting at. She herself says in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem that sometimes revenge can serve justice, and it depends if it's done in the right way. And I think that that's part of what she has in mind here. And so political action for her must be great. It can't just be good. It can't be bad. It must be glorious. In the last chapter we read for today on Homo Faber, the basic point here is that in labor, the anima laborans, says that the greatest that man can achieve is life. In work, the Homo Faber says the greatest that man can achieve is his products. And in action, we say that the greatest man can achieve is to appear, to be. And yet both labor and work also require a world where there can be a kind of reality and appearance. There's a criteria for this reality, is a kind of commonness and what is common to us all. And Arendt doesn't think that the labor world can really help preserve that common world, but to some degree, the world of Homo Faber, the exchange market, can. It can't commit to glory, but it has a kind of public nature in which we actualize ourselves through our things. But she thinks that the actualization of ourselves through our things degrades us and doesn't in the end disclose who we are. It discloses what we've produced. And even genius, which produces these things, is in a constant predicament in which the things overwhelm the person, and we produce things that and we hide behind it, and we don't reveal ourselves. And so in that sense, while Homo Faber can create things that become part of a public world and a common world, they can't create the rapport, the joint action, the political acting in common that Arendt believes is essential for power to emerge. All right, I'm going to stop there. These are incredibly rich sections of this text. These are some of the most quoted and discussed parts of the book. So I assume we'll have a rich and hopefully a little bit provocative and controversial discussion. We'll keep it orderly and yet extraordinary at the same time in the Arendtian spirit. All right, for those I think who know, there's two ways to make your voice heard, to act and speak in public. The more public one is to raise your hand, and you can do that by clicking on the reactions tab at the bottom of your page in Zoom and clicking raise hand. And I will call on you generally in the order that you raise your hand. There's also a chat, which is already quite active. And I won't be able to read that as well, but people do have wonderful discussions in the chat. So welcome, and let's the games begin. The first hand up is James Kyberd. We got to unmute yourselves. And I just want to remind everybody, we have a lot of people on, try and keep a lot of hands up already. I see a ton of hands up. try and keep our comments and questions brief to the extent that's possible.
Yes, Roger. These chapters have astounded me. They've uh, reconstructed my inner life in a bizarre way, and I'm wondering. Um, and I have been in the space of public appearance in my life, and it's gone now. Um, but does our culture? How did our culture? Does our culture teach us to engender this space of appearance and an awareness of this? I've never learned about any of this in my life. Where do people? Where does it come from? Where does the culture give us this awareness? I never really heard it this way before. And
That's
the
a
idea of um, individuals reifying the elementary fact that the essence of who somebody is cannot be reified by himself seems to be at stake now with all of this media and Twitter and Instagram, etc. People seem to be trying to reify themselves every second. Um, where in the culture is the education for us to be prepared for this?
it's a great question, James. Um, thank you. You know, and let's first just step back and say, um, this space does not always exist. She says that very thing on page 199. This space does not always exist. There are many times and places in history where there is no space of appearance in totalitarian regimes, in sometimes in tyrannical regimes, and sometimes just in authoritarian regimes where there's no public space. Um, she does think that all men, as she says in the next line on 199, are capable of deed and word, and most of them. And now look at the list she gives, like the slave, the foreigner, and the barbarian antiquity, or the laborer or craftsman in the modern age, the job holder or businessman in our world, do not live in it. Most of us, she says, make either are forced or make a choice to not live in the public world. And that's because living in the public world is hard. As you know, James, it means reading reviews of yourself. And sometimes they're great and sometimes they're not. I'm sure yours are always great, but I mean, the point is that the first virtue of politics, she'll say over and again, is courage. You have to leave your private life, and this sucks, and most people don't want to do it. And so businessmen, job holders, no, I don't need that. And no one can live in it all the time, right? It's just too much. And yet, she says, to be deprived of it means to be deprived of reality, which humanly and politically speaking is the same as appearance. Now, this is the philosophical conversation that she's having with the traditional philosophy, whereas from Plato on, what's said is that being is higher than appearance. So in the Republic, the theory of ideas, the idea is that the appearance, the image of something, is less real than the ideal of it, which is lasting forever, whereas the image will fade and degrade, and therefore it's not as real. And she's offering a turn, an inversion of that, whereas that appearance is actually the foundation of being. Now, so where does this, I haven't answered your question, I've only given the negative of how hard it is. Where do you get trained? Where do you learn to do it? On one answer is, and she says this on page 194, there is an urge to this. And this is something that Arendt writes in so many ways in so many of her books. So in The Life of the Mind, she'll talk about how butterflies have an urge to present themselves and to appear and be seen, and that they look beautiful, and that nature privileges beauty because there's a deep urge to be recognized and seen. But beauty can mean a lot of things, but it privileges orderliness. It privileges those who are worthy of being seen in some way. And so on 194, she says, no doubt this concept of action is highly individualistic, right? Again, she's not a collectivist. She's not, I don't want to politicize this. She's not a socialist, not in an economic sense, because she actually, has a lot of socialism in her. She's not a socialist in the sense, I'm being very careful how I said this, I hope, of believing that we are part of a social species and that is where our worth lies. She thinks that action can only be connected to an individual. And we talked about this last week. Can there be group artworks? Can there be group projects? And I think there can, but you have to rethink this in some way. And she says it stresses the urge towards self-disclosure. Other factors, and there remains relatively touched and just like the butterfly in man, an urge to disclose oneself, an urge to show ourselves in public, to act and appear. We're very good at turning off that urge because it's dangerous and it's discomforting, and yet we all have that urge. Within that, then you ask the question, well, how do you learn to do it? And to some degree, that's where you talk about models, exemplars, but also a culture of action. I mean, one of the things that, again, she found remarkable about the United States when she arrived was this culture of when people feel there's something wrong in the world, they band together and they act and they form movements and protests and nonprofits and NGOs. And she just found that to be unique in its intensity here. And she thought it went back to a historical form. But she also came to see it as part of the structure, the constitutional structure of local governance and of lack of sovereignty, which she thinks is part of the American tradition, which sadly she believes has been lost by the late 20th century, or largely lost by the late 20th century. So, a lot of it is culture, character, examples, structure, constitutional structures that all provide encouragement for a natural urge so that we overcome our also fairly natural fear of acting in public. Sorry, that was a long answer to a short question, well put question, but I hope it helped. Is that all right, James?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Jeff Glaza.
Hi, I'm going to keep my camera off because you're buffering quite a bit. So if I turn mine on, it might just... At the risk of sounding pretentious, I'm going to call this the lifestyle question. And it's kind of adjacent to James's, but I wanted to go in a more personal direction. Like how does one live this sort of, I found these sections very exhilarating. I've had various kinds of public experiences besides this one, running a meetup group, a karaoke, Toastmasters, that kind of thing. So, I mean, I really dig this sort of stuff. But it's like, but how does one do it? I mean, you get the, I'm posing it to you particularly because, well, you're in New York, as so many people on this call probably are. and that's sort of the center of public life in the United States. Do we move to the nearest urban center and try and get on stage? And then that's the first question, and the exclusivity part of it. And the second half of it is, well, once you get there, how do you just not go to parties all the time? You know, I mean, like, whereas the thinking has to happen alone, right? You need a room of your own, as Wolf would say. And I think it's a pretty common experience that people go and they get all these ideas, but they never get anything written down because they got to go on to the next engagement. So I'm just wondering that balancing act. How do we do it in this world? Not the theoretical one of how the country should be if we stay true to Tocqueville's ideals, but how do we do it nowadays?
Thanks, Jeff. You know, I'm going to start by being a little contentious and say that I think New York is not place, and that actually public life is incredibly rare in New York. And so I say that, you know, New York is in large part, or in important part, a city of business and parties. And neither business or parties is what Arendt has in mind, I think, by the space of appearance. Now, it also is a city of performance, and I think that's closer. So you're right about that. But I just want to say that for Arendt, you know, I think if in anything, New Yorkers are often so busy and so, you know, caught up in their own very busy lives. It's the city of the bourgeoisie, that you have a kind of attitude of, oh, I'll vote once every couple of years, I'll elect my representatives, I'll outsource my political engagement, but I don't actually have to do it myself. And to that extent, you know, I don't see New York as a very active, powerful place in the Arendtian framework. So, you know, I think it's important there. You know, I think to understand this sort of lifestyle question, as you put it, it requires, from an Arendtian point of view, that we put aside our private personal interests and we dedicate a certain amount of our time to the public interest. Whether that means holding office, engaging in political work, you know, going to town hall meetings, going to citizen boards, you know, and I think this is something, you know, that is quite rare today. And that's part of the modern bourgeois loss of action and power that Arendt is worried about. You know, she says in On Revolution, right, that the great failure of the American Constitution was that it didn't, in the sense, constitutionalize small local forums for citizens to act together. It sort of took them for granted in her mind that they would continue to exist, and as they have faded, there's no space to replace them. So, you know, if you're asking the lifestyle question, I think becomes, how do you as a person, as an individual, make the difficult and courageous choice to put aside your family and professional and economic and pleasurable interests in the name of engaging in a public act that is risky and yet allows you to strive for glory and act with others in the public world.
Thank you. That actually helps a lot. I think I might be further along than I thought I was.
Good. Catherine.
Hey, thanks. So I've, like, in a sense, I've been waiting for this chapter for like a couple of years, being on and off this reading group. And I have always been so interested in Arendt's construction of like how she understands power. Like that's like one of my main interests of her. And I feel like these sections, obviously she talks about it fairly explicitly. So, and you kind of said it in your introduction, but I'm just wondering, like, can you just tell us like help me understand, how does she think about power? And in particular, the like, there are places here, and I think there's places in Nonviolence too, where she talks about power as being, I get the sense that it's like not reified, like it's not tangible, you know, like that instruments of violence and tools, those are tangible things, even privilege and wealth, those are tangible things. But power itself is not that. It's this sort of like people together speaking and acting, but like it's very different. I feel like most of the rest of like philosophical history that I read about power just understands it differently. And I keep trying to understand, how is she different? And does she think power is a thing, like at all? I know it's not something she thinks we can store up, but it's like, is it a thing? Yeah, there's a, like, I could ask so many questions, but there's a string of them for you. Thanks.
Thanks, Catherine. Is power a thing? It's a complicated question because you got to ask me what a thing is. I'm going to be a little philosophical, but no, I don't think power is a thing. Power is dunamus, right? Or Amugen, or Vermögen. It's a potential, right? You know, so if you think of your old, is it physics or chemistry, where you talk about energy and potential energy? I forget which one. You can see my training. But in those old science topics that we did in high school or wherever, we learned about potential energy and actual energy. Power is a potential, and it's always something that can rise up, as she says, when people act together. And so if you want to, I think the closest she ever offers to a definition of power, as I understand it, and Jerry, you tell me if I'm wrong, is to act in concert, or that it's action in concert. It's to act together with others in some rapport, in, you know, with a concert, not with some end, right? You're not achieving something per se, but we act together. And in some ways, like a concert, it's melodious or harmonic, and the actions are beautiful in some sense, and they have a kind of virtuosity to them. And so she says that, you know, and you said, how is it different from other people? Well, you know, I mean, I think many people who write about these issues think of power along the lines of strength, my capacity to lift something, or my capacity to accomplish something. And she says power is not strength. Strength is a quality of an individual in isolation, where power springs up between men when they act together, and then it vanishes the moment they disperse, right? So, you know, power is ephemeral. She calls it a will o' the wisp, right? In the introduction, in the prologue to Between Past and Future. It's not something stable or reliable. And it's also it's independent of material factors. So you don't have to be rich to be powerful. You can be poor and powerful. You don't have to be strong to be powerful. You can be weak and be powerful. The one thing power needs is plurality. It needs a plurality of people who are both unique and equal, and thus can come together and act. And thus she says that they need a city of some sort. I mean, it doesn't have to be a big urban city, but they need some sort of place. They need a living together. And she says that living together is the only material need of power. And one other thing she says is that wherever people.
So Roger, just can I interrupt you just a
Go ahead.
second on that? Like, so when people don't have an equality of power,
Yeah.
like, I think that's one of the things that trips me up, because we talk about empowerment, we talk about the need to share power, like all of, like, the language that we have around power.
When you say when people don't have an equality of power, what do you mean? Right? Because I don't think she thinks like that. An inequality of power, it doesn't mean that one group or person, I mean, no person has power. You only have power in groups. And a group of poor, unarmed people can beat a rich, heavily armed force. They could also lose, but they can beat them. There's not an inequality of power in any kind of set sense. In the end, which side has more power is determined by which side compels more people to act together in ways that that increase their power. There are levels of there can be the inequalities can be so stark, let's say, that if you have like a force shield and nuclear bombs, and you can just bomb everyone around you into smithereens, or you have a robot army that could just destroy everyone, yeah, at some point, no amount of power maybe will overwhelm you. When we think of inequalities of power, you have to be a little careful. It's not like wealth or strength or stuff like that. Go ahead, Catherine. I'm sorry. I just wanted to point that out.
No, that's helpful. It's very different than, I feel like, in sort of popular and philosophical discussions, the ways that we talk about power. So it's almost, I find it hard to put her in conversation with talking about power, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, I think, this is, again, Arendt, I've made this distinction a number of times. She thinks that there are certain people, well, she says that anyone is capable of acting and having power. She's aware that there are certain people for whom it's very hard, if not impossible. So, for example, people in a concentration camp. For example, people who are so poor as to be miserable, and thus they worry so much just about their survival that they don't have time to act together with others. Slaves and Native Americans in American history, and even women to some degree, who were excluded and invisible from the public world. So for these, in these situations, she's very aware that power is something that is unequal and is almost impossible. But as long as you can act and bring people together, and thus, even if you're a woman who doesn't have the vote, and you can march and claim the vote and claim suffragette and claim suffrage, you have power. And at that point, she thinks the inequality conversation is about who's going to win. And it's not based, and there's not one side that has a necessary advantage based on who has more money and resources. I mean, obviously there are advantages, but they're not decisive for her. Alex McAuliffe.
Hey, Roger. Thanks. My question is about the exact same part of this section, also about power and about the way that she defines it compared to other, I guess, other maybe more common, but certainly less specific ways of defining it. And I have in mind mostly Eric Hoffer's definition of power in a book like The True Believer, where his focus is on power as something that is also created intrapersonally, but he is speaking about power as something that's created between atomized, frustrated individuals. So this is like the power generated by a mass movement. And so I was struck by the difference between the source of, for Arendt, it can only be individuals acting together as individuals. For Hoffer, it can only be non-individuals acting out of frustration with their own individuality. But in either case, what the thinker is saying is generated by this process is power. So I don't mean to muddy the waters further with another definition of power, but I was hoping that you might help me think through where, kind of how those two definitions of power clash, or how Arendt would deal with that distinction.
Yeah, as I'm sure you know, Alex, Arendt and Hopper were a two-person mutual admiration society. They both had enormous respect for each other. Arendt said of Hopper that he was the only intellectual she met when she was teaching at Berkeley. And for those who don't know, she was teaching at Berkeley and Hopper was a longshoreman. I don't think they're that different. I'd have to go back and read the Hopper, which I haven't read in a little while, True Believer. Yes, Hopper is concerned with one particular kind of power, which is the power of mass movements. Arendt, would, I think, include that within her definition of power. It's people acting together. So she talks about this on page 203 a bit. I mentioned it in my introduction, where she says the will to power, as the modern age from Hobbes to Nietzsche understood it in glorification or denunciation, far from being a characteristic of the strong, is like envy and greed among the vices of the weak, and possibly even their most dangerous one. So this is, I think, very much what Hopper is describing in True Believer, in his arguments about.
Yeah, I agree. That was where I kind of felt both the similarity and maybe the conflict most was in that passage.
So, well, but you'll have to tell me where the conflict is, because what she says then is, if tyranny can be described as the always abortive attempt to substitute violence for power, ochlocracy, or mob rule, which is its exact counterpart of tyranny, can be characterized by the much more promising attempt to substitute power for strength. That strikes me as what mass movements do. They seek to, instead of being tyrants where one strong man seeks to use violence to impose rule, mass movements and eventually totalitarian governments, if they become in charge of the government, use the power of numbers to destroy all the institutions in society, be they clubs or schools or independent organizations or aristocracies that could resist.
So it's sort of a corruption, or a taking the idea of power as the ultimate good to exactly its kind of logical conclusion.
The will to power, okay, in its most populist and unlimited form. And I think Hopper sees that brilliantly in his work, and that's why he's such a great a reader and interrogator of mass movements because he sees it very much in these ways. And he's a critic of mass movements for exactly those reasons. So I think that, yeah, I mean, I think mass movements are for Arendt a corruption of power. I mean, that's how she presents it here. And I think that's—
Thank you. That's
right.
very helpful.
Okay. Hold on. Got lost here. Barbara Stern.
Well, actually, you got John Stern on Barbara Stern's device.
Okay, John.
There's a couple of points that have struck me about this very rich reading that we've had, but particularly one of them is where James asked the question initially, where is the power, where is the public space today? And when I read that, when I hear that, I look at what she has to say on page 198. It's everywhere, and she continues on the next page. We're saying this space of appearance comes into being wherever men are together in the manner of speech and action, and we see throughout today the examples are rife all around us. But it just seems what is troubling, or it seems troubling, is the excesses it goes to. So it loses, it seems to be corrupted in many forms. But what I find interesting is that that power seems, or not power, but this human adaptability springs spontaneously, and it doesn't matter the field. One of the things I'm thinking of very particularly is the emergence of these cryptocurrencies, and specifically, you had at the fall of finance in 2008, what emerged was a currency, Bitcoin, for example, which was really an expression to take away, to establish some form of lasting stability in the financial area from a government that continuously corrupted or seems to corrupt the stability of the currency. And I don't want to dwell, I really don't want to dwell on that. I have just two very brief points I'd like to put on the table here. One, her signal foundations for the human condition as it changed has been the atomic bomb, as I read it, and the ability to go to space, two external events. And I wonder if she was alive today, what she'd say about the development of CRISPR, the ability to go within us to change who we are. And I feel that's a dynamic that is out there in a future in many indefinable ways, certainly beyond my ability to think. But it just seems it's so it's a state, just a significant event that's occurred for the human condition, and we're not talking about it. We're not really discussing it, and this is going to affect, it seems to me, the human condition in ways that are considerably beyond what we might imagine today. And then the other point, which is really meant to, is of very little significance, but it struck me as I was reading this, and the triumvirate of power, strength, and violence, it constantly, and the fluidity between the three of them, going from one to the other. It just reminded me, as a youngster, we used to play this game of rock, paper, scissors, and it just felt like this was the same continuum in when I think on these thoughts. So I've spoken a little longer than I had planned to, And thank you very much, Roger.
Thanks, Barbara or John.
John.
I know. Yeah, a few things. You know, you said, you quoted on 198, wherever you go, you will be a polis. I just want to be clear that that doesn't mean we have polises everywhere. You know, you will go everywhere you go, you will be a polis if you're a polis. That means if you act and speak courageously outside together in public. I think she would say that today the polis would be extraordinarily rare if it exists anywhere. You know, one question.
Well, I think there's an actuation of it. There's that you spoke about the fact of there's a potential. It needs to be energized, and maybe that's I needed to add that. Yeah, I think
but here's
where we go.
John,
This is a
Could I ask a question here?
let me
Roger?
let me just respond to John, and then I'll let you ask a question, Susan.
Okay.
The problem is, and this, because this is something I think people are very mixed up about. You know, something like the Black Lives Matter protests happen, and people say, oh, people are acting together, and therefore a polis emerges. No, right? A certain action together happens, a protest happens, but a polis is when there's a space for, in the whole society and the whole polis, and people can act together from a plurality of points of view, including those who disagree and from different viewpoints. And so, you know, I think there's a real question today if we have a polis, if we have a political entity left in the United States of America where people could act together. And I don't know if we do or where it is. Susan, I'm sorry.
I mean, I was just wondering as I was reading this too about, you know, that the polis can be wherever you act or speak with others, whether or not the internet or Substack, whether these forums could be such a polis, and on the other hand, how they're a threat to it. Yeah. And how to think about that.
Well, again, the way to, I mean, again, what I just said to John, I think applies to the extent you're acting together with people you agree with, you're engaged in a advocacy or a movement or a protest or whatever, but it's not a polis.
But could there be a virtual polis? That's what I'm wondering.
You know, I think.
I mean, why not? And let me ask it that way.
You know, I think the jury is out on that.
Yeah.
You know, I certainly don't think we have the technology for it yet. And if we ever would, I don't know. But you know, I know there's a lot of people who ask that question from an Arendtian point of view.
Well, are you not saying that the polis of today is really it's been corrupted by it's traveling to an extreme point? We have area. We have you turn on one. It doesn't seem to be any reasonable, rational, or exchange of ideas. That it's lost its sense of respecting the other. Is that what is occurred?
I mean, I think what I'm saying is, I'm sorry. Am I losing my internet? Can you hear me? Or
you tend to break up, but
I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah, but you've been breaking up from time to time.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, I'll do what I can. The problem is bigger than that. The problem is where is the space of appearance today? And the space of appearance, you know, when you say that wherever you go, you will be a polis, you need a polis to have a space of appearance. You need a space of appearance to have a polis. And right now, most people in the United States don't engage in action. They live their bourgeois professional lives, whether it's because they're rich or they're poor or whatever, and they think other people will deal with the public world. And so already they've corrupted and evacuated that themselves from that. Then there's the question of what institutions are there for there actually to be the kind of action in concert that would build a real world, a public world. And increasingly those are rare, partly because of the polarization and radicalization John's talking about, but I don't think that's the main issue. I think that's a symptom of the fact that we don't have the traditions and the spaces for people to come together. So I think that's the bigger issue there. On the CRISPR issue, all I'll say is that Arendt talks about that in the prologue, in the prologue to this book, right? Genetic engineering. It's not that she thinks the atomic bomb and space are the sort of two threats to the human condition. The ultimate threat to the human condition is world alienation. And that is grounded in science and the rise of science, because what science does is it alienates us from a common world and lets us live increasingly in an internal epistemological world. And we'll get there in the last chapter of the book. That's what it's all about. So we'll come back to that. But what Arendt says in the prologue to the book about genetic engineering is that as we do so, people will, do their own things, change their genes, and the result will be that we will increasingly not live in a shared common world. And I think that's definitely CRISPR has a lot to say about that. And it's something she was thinking about in 1950s when she wrote this book.
I missed that, so thank you.
Yeah.
I didn't think it in terms of threat. I thought it was more of these are seminal moments in history that one and two of them being of an external nature and the third being internal, that we're on a journey, have no idea where it's going to take us. I don't know, and it could be positive or negative. I don't think that's to be that we need a polis to determine that, and we're not having. And we have that in a rational discussion any longer, or at least I don't see it. Maybe others do.
Great, thank you. Hal.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I almost have two questions. And the first question is really, I know Arendt is not a fan of Fanon and his conception of violence. And in Sartre writes a lot about when people act together in what he calls the fused group. Basically, he says that the group needs continued violence within it in order to constitute it, and then therefore be able to continuously exist. But then also my question is about the public space and the polis. I guess, what is the distinction between the idea of the bourgeois public space and the polis, and to what extent is there really a difference between, say, a newspaper op-ed page? The New York Times just got rid of their op-ed page, at least in name, they don't want to call it that. But that place where people exchange ideas and arguments, that social media and like physical in-person protest, because to me, they're all to a certain extent places of appearance. Now you could say that a partisan basis, so to the extent to which the New York Times itself was considered an advocacy vehicle for, say, liberalism, or the Wall Street Journal op-ed is considered an advocacy for conservatism, then that could be considered an actor of a sort. But if there can be like a public sphere, which is in theory neutral, all of these platforms, I mean, there's like censorship in all of them to a certain extent, public protests, there are protests that are banned in some countries because of the political content, or in social media apps, those sometimes ban certain political content because it's too extreme. And then, of course, newspaper op-ed pages that are editors saying some people can't write in there. So that was my question.
Yeah, thanks, Hal. I think, these are hard questions, and I'm not sure I have all the right answers to them. A newspaper is a private for-profit company, most of them. So are social media companies. Can they be the kind of space of appearance? Obviously, people appear on them and act in them. A few things to say. One is, they're generally not available for everybody, right? In the sense that you have to pay to get in. And you have to be, in a certain friend group or thread or subscriber or whatever it is.
What about PBS and C-SPAN too? I need to add.
I mean, yeah, there are obvious, there are public goods and spaces. They're also probably the least popular of our spaces. So I think, yes, you can find public spaces. I mean, the Congress and the House of Representatives and the Senate are public spaces, as are other public parks, C-SPAN and others, as you said. But a lot of these public spaces are largely ignored by most of the country. And I think that's a symptom of what Arendt's talking about. That most people, is partly a corruption of the people, that they care more about their jobs and their enjoyments and their private lives than they do about the res publica, the public thing, or the virtue of the public virtue. And part of it is that they're just not interested. That's a corruption of the body politic, as she would put it. And to the extent people do act in public, it's often through what she'll call mob rule or movements, as we were talking about before around Eric Hopper. And there's a real question of, well, okay, outside of those movements, where are the spaces where people get together and talk about things of the public interest? There's a few that exist, and they're very, in my view, they're very important institutions in this country. Maybe the number one is the jury, right? The jury is one of the most important institutions in the United States, not because it makes the right decision about legal cases, but because it's one of the few institutions where everyday people have an opportunity to come together with a plurality of people who often have very different backgrounds and perspectives and views, and have a public conversation on matters of public significance, of what's right and wrong. That's why Tocqueville said that the jury is the most important institution of American democracy, because it teaches people public virtue and teaches people how to act in public. And I think, while Arendt didn't speak about the jury specifically in those ways, I think she saw things like town hall meetings and small local forums and discussion groups that were open to all as similar, which is why she says that the great mistake we made was not creating a constitutional space and requirement for these kind of forums and fora where people would come together and talk with each other in a pluralistic way about matters of public significance. So for those of you who know, who've been following the Arendt Center for the last year, and are interested in these things called citizen assemblies, where lotteries are used to pick hundreds of people to come together to speak about an issue and make recommendations or talk about it or offer legislative ideas. And this is what our conference will be about in October coming up this year. In many ways, these citizen assemblies, which are also sometimes called citizen juries, are an attempt to create public spaces in which people have the opportunity and they habitual and become habituated in this act of public conversation, not amongst a group of activists who have the same view or the same op-ed page that we read or our same friends in our Facebook feed, but with general randomly selected other people, and talk to them and try and come to agreements and common views about big issues in our society. So to me, this movement to think about and bring up citizen assemblies is one effort to think about an Arendtian response to the corruption of the body politic today. Robert McKay.
Roger, I'd like to ask about a couple of passages on page 203 and 205. Can you hear me all right?
You're in and out, but yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Okay.
You're in and out, but I hear you.
Okay. Especially I want to ask it about the phrase power corrupts. So let me read the first passage that puzzles me. It has to do with strength, power, force, all that group of terms. All right, just about the middle of page 203. Strength can only be ruled by power, can only be ruined by power, and is therefore always in danger from the combined force of the many. Power corrupts. Indeed, when the weak band, power corrupts indeed, when the weak band together in order to ruin the strong, but not before. The will to power, as the modern age from Hobbes to Nietzsche understood it, in glorification or denunciation, far from being a characteristic of the strong, is like envy and greed among the vices of the weak, and possibly even their most dangerous one. I understand that passage at all, but let me turn to page 205, bottom of 204. The Platonic and Christian distrust of the splendor attending its space of appearance, power's space of appearance. Nothing, finally, in the modern age, more common than the conviction that power corrupts. And I'm puzzled and a bit put off by her rather negative dismissal of the thought that power corrupts. I would have thought that that's something we see in front of us every day. So let me stop there.
So just so I know, Bob, were you on when the first passage you read, I read earlier and in another answer to a question and talked about it. Were you on when that happened and you still don't understand it? Or did you miss that? I'm not hearing you, but can you hear me? Am I on now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So basically the first power, Rob.
Yeah. Well, my attention may have flagged. I don't know.
All right, so I don't want to
Um,
repeat myself completely, but
Oh,
the power corrupts indeed when the weak band together in order to
yes,
in order
yes.
to ruin the strong, and not.
Perhaps,
All right.
perhaps I just missed something.
Okay. Basically, the idea in this is that power corrupts when the weak band together and not only oppose the strong or engage with the strong and act together as a polis, but seek to ruin the strong. And in doing so, uh, you then have like envy and greed, a vice in which the power of the weak can become a mob rule, and can seek to impose a unitary view on society that does away with plurality. I talked about it earlier, so maybe we come back to it, or you can watch it, listen to it again online. The other passage you mentioned on from 204 to 205, again, it's about power corruption. I mean, this is a point Arendt makes repeatedly in her work.
Okay,
What's the issue? All right, just try and you're breaking up when you talk, so let me try and talk. Otherwise, I can't figure out where we are. The point is that for Arendt, power is the foundation of all democratic, republican.
she seems to be, she's, okay. Okay,
Robert, I can't tell if you're talking or not, because I keep hearing you talking, but I don't know if you're talking to me or not. All right. Power, when she says that power corrupts, which she wants to,
I wasn't,
okay,
I wasn't just
No.
then,
okay. The worry,
but liberals are very attached to the notion that power corrupts.
all right, this is not about, okay. I think there's a lot of people who are attached to the notion that power corrupts, and Arendt has a counterintuitive opinion here, which is that power is actually what protects us against all, well, power is what allows us to build a world of freedom. And without power, and if we eradicate power, we will then be subject to violence or strength or force. And so we have to actually not seek to limit power, but multiply it. And the brilliance, she thought, of the federal constitutional division of powers in the United States was that it created multiple power sources, and that the only way to oppose the real danger, which is totalitarianism or tyranny, is the multiplication of powers. What she says is there's a distrust of power that that has its roots in Plato, right? We've talked about this in the sense that Plato wants to limit power through truth because he doesn't trust power and doesn't trust the people. And in Christianity, and again, for the same reasons, and so Christianity wants to distrust the people making their own decisions and wants to read the liturgy to them. And that this is mirrored in the modern age by those who are like experts or bureaucrats who want to rule things according to kinds of truths rather than and a kind of expertise rather than have politicians and power oppose them. And so all of these people, from Arendt's point of view, engage in this mistrust of power. She then goes into a discussion of Pericles, who she says evinces what she calls a faith in power that elevates action and action to the highest level. And this is where she leads to her discussions about power as not based on success, as different from behavior, as not based in morality, but as based in greatness. And this and glory. And this is where she then makes these statements that upset so many people, right? Where she says that that greatness can only be judged that action can only be judged by greatness. The criterion being to break through the commonly accepted and reach into the extraordinary, where whatever is true and common in everyday life no longer applies because everything that exists is unique and sui generis. This is a controversial claim, but so for Arendt's defense of power and action against expertise, truth, and moral probity of Plato, experts in Christianity, you have to be willing to accept the disorderliness and uniqueness and extraordinariness of messy politics and great action and even evil. And that's something that Arendt sticks to. And it's not going to make everybody happy.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Hold on, Vivian.
Hi. Actually, this is a really good moment because what I want to put to you in terms of the ideas of power and the aspect of power that is related to actions that are concerned, for example, with revenge, or the beauty of revenge, or glorious action, or a glorious virtuosic action, all of these things, and the fact that you reminded us of your legal training, and by the way, I want to make my want to bring in my central idea, but by the way, I've never understood the benefit of juries. De Tocqueville notwithstanding, I can't see how it does not signify that juries habitually make bad or less than perfect decisions, because they seem to me to be a function of compromise or consensus, and so never reach the very best or the rightest decision. But in any case, what I want to say here has to do with, and just mentioning this is provocative and controversial. If you consider the action of 9/11, and when that happened, when the buildings, specifically when the two towers imploded and fell, the legendary German composer Karl-Heinz Stockhausen made himself extremely unpopular and utterly persona non grata in the United States of America by admiring this as a perfect work of art. And I have to say, I mean, I knew exactly what he meant. It was action, perfection of action. Personified, the way I think it unfolded better than the wildest dreams of the people who planned this action. So I guess I just want to know, I'm interested in the morality involved here, and with considering a statement like Stockhausen's, and so that's my legal and moral. I know that I understand that legal And justice has not to do with morality, but legal matters have to do with justice, which is not the same as morality. But I'm very interested in power and morality and this idea of revenge.
Yeah. So I'll start with the last part first. On 206, she writes, Pericles and Thucydides knew full well, this is the top of 206, that he had broken with the normal standards for everyday behavior when he found the glory of Athens in having left behind, quote, everywhere everlasting remembrance of their good and their evil deeds. Action can be good or evil. And Stockhausen, I may have been wrong to say it when he said it and in the way he said it. I think he probably was wrong to say it when he said it. But yeah, there was something gloriously evil about 9/11.
Well, gloriously perfect too, in terms of execution and just conception too.
Yeah, I mean, I guess glory would mean perfect in this sense, but yes, there can be gloriously good and gloriously evil, but the point is action is not judged by the criteria of good or evil. It's judged by the criteria of perfection or glory. And so given that, right, if you accept that view, to make an argument for action and the importance of action in politics, and to go back to the conversation I was having with Robert, that we don't want to diminish power and action, but we actually want to multiply them, is a risky argument to make, because it's going to probably mean that there will be more gloriously good, but also more gloriously evil actions in the world. That's part of plurality and power and democracy from Arendt's point of view. You can therefore not maybe be more sympathetic with Plato and the Christians and the experts who are seeking to live in power and think power corrupts, and seeking to regulate it because they don't want that. They don't want Socrates being killed by the mob. They don't want people practicing their own versions of religion as heretics. They want a kind of order and professional guidance for the world. But Arendt is here offering an ideal of action and politics that has a much wider criteria of what is part of the public world.
Yeah.
Roger, would it be simplistic, or would it be a good simple example of power, action, and plurality achieved and personified? Thinking of, for example, the German invasion in 1941, in June of 41, of the Soviet Union, where of course they immediately had a bunch of victories, but then very soon afterwards it became clear that this huge, unwieldy, untrained, unarmed army that were the Soviet citizens were going to win this and be powerful. Or thinking of when the Tiananmen Square incident, an event happened, thinking of that single student standing in front of the tank, that iconic image. So are those examples, or are they not examples?
So I think those are good examples. And so what I wanted to add to what I had said is, while it may be so, there's a danger, right, in action, and the danger is that people will act in evil ways. Arendt's one response to that is, from Arendt, or one defense of that is, look, people are always going to act in evil ways. At least when power is active and dispersed and plural, we can respond to 9/11, and we can respond to the German invasion of Russia, and we can respond to the Chinese Communist Party's clearing of Tiananmen with power against it. But when you unify power in one philosopher king, or a pope, or an expert class, and then that expert class or that king or that pope turns evil, there's nothing left to stop it. And so that's where Arendt is coming from. Her point of view is not that we should love the fact that action produces evil sometimes. It's that people are always going to do evil, but you want to at least have as many different plural forces, so that any one group that starts doing evil can be opposed by others. That's her argument. And the only way to prevent really horrific totalitarian evil from spreading all over the earth is by pluralizing power, which means that you have to have faith in power, like Pericles did, and not say wherever we find power, it corrupts and we have to extirpate it. That's the argument that's being made.
Did she, what did she, I forget if you said, but what did Arendt, for example, how did she view the power or the benefit of a jury, for example, in the United States?
She herself, I don't remember her. I can't remember her talking much about the jury. She may have mentioned it here and there. So I don't.
What would your view be in an Arendtian sense, or your own view of the goodness of it, if it's so badly effective often? Or at least I'm saying that.
Well, I mean, she does talk about a jury in the end of the Eichmann book when she talks about revenge. And she says that an act of revenge is an illegal act, but it can be brought back into the law and made just if the avenger gives himself up and asks a jury to decide whether he's innocent or guilty. And she has two examples in mind. The one that I know better is the case of Shalom Schwarzbard, who was a Ukrainian Jew who escaped the pogroms in the 1917, the white army pogroms of the Ukrainians in 1917, and went to Paris.
Yeah, like my grandfather, by the way. Yeah, 1917. Yeah.
And went to Paris, and while he was in Paris, he noticed that also in Paris was Ilan Petlura, who had been the Khatman of the White Army and had helped lead the pogroms. And so Shalom Schwarzbard waited outside a restaurant where Petlura was eating. When Petlura came out, he said, are you Ilan Petlura? Petlura said, get out of my way, you Jew scum. And Schwarzbard shot him 6 times and killed him. Stood there, and when the police came, says, my name is Shalom Schwarzbard. I have avenged the Jews.
Yeah.
He put himself on trial, and in 10 minutes, a Parisian jury found him not guilty. And a perfect example.
You've broken up. You've broken up. You've broken up after you said, and in 10 minutes, the Parisian jury found him not guilty, and then I didn't hear anything.
Can you hear me now?
Now, yes.
And Arendt found this to be a perfect example of an illegal act brought back into the mantle of justice
Yes.
By a jury.
Yes.
In my work on revenge, which was done over a decade ago when I wrote a series of essays and articles on it, and was writing a book on it that never got finished. The argument was that whereas law treats everybody equally, and therefore tries to create a kind of equality of treatment, the basic problem with that is that sometimes justice requires distinction. And what revenge does is makes an act, someone who takes revenge says, I have the right to do justice beyond the law. The law is not
yes, outside of the law, sure, yes.
outside of the law. But what Arendt adds to that, and I think is important, is that the avenger can only make a claim to do justice if they then let themselves be judged
Yes.
by a jury.
Yes, take the consequences and be willing to be convicted. Yeah.
Exactly. So, from that point of view, I think a jury can speak the law, can speak justice beyond the law, and that's that's one of the great things about the jury. The jury is not supposed to speak the law. They give a verdire, a verdict of justice. Speaking of justice, do they sometimes get it wrong? Yes. But I think, personally, the combination of their ability to be a safety valve against laws that are not just, and the educative function of them in a political way, they turn people, average people, into public-minded citizens for a week or two every 4 years.
That is true, yes.
Is actually, to me, more than worth whatever bad decisions they may make. So,
okay, good. Point taken. Thanks for reminding me. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
My Arendtian attempt, or attempted Arendtian defense of the jury.
Thank you.
Aldo, Aspelqueta. Aldo?
Yeah, okay, now. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I wanted you to talk more about the concept of strength as opposed or different from power and violence, and also question if you see a correspondence in the strength and violence as the strength of the body and the violence of the hands. I mean, there's some relation about it. Strength is related to it's more personal, or there is something beyond it. That's it.
Okay, I'll try. She talks a little bit more about all these concepts in her essay on violence in part 2. So you could go back and read that, or watch the videos we've made on violence. But in a basic sense, for Arendt, strength is the strength of one man, and it's in isolation. It's a gift to the individual, which cannot be shared with others. So I'm strong, I can lift something, I can make good arguments, but I can't share it with others. If I'm strong, I can resist violence, right? But I can't really resist power, which can overwhelm me if there's a lot of people who oppose me. So strength is, I think, the least politically important of these three. Unless someone can, I've always thought, okay, she defines it, but I'm not really sure what she does with it. Violence is important. Violence is the ability to use force to destroy or kill or win. And violence, in the end, she says, if it's used completely indiscriminately, can overwhelm both strength and power. I mean, if you're willing to just kill everybody, you know, as she says, if the British were willing to exert pure violence on Gandhi, they would have won. And part of the reason Gandhi could win is because the British weren't willing to go full out violence, because to go out to fully embrace violence is to weaken your power, because it's to lose your legitimacy. And thus, to some degree, you know, it's very hard to become fully violent. The one caveat she makes to that is that if we could, if a tyrant could create a robot army that would be absolutely loyal, then they could probably overwhelm all power and strength in the world and lay waste to it, because they wouldn't have to worry about the legitimacy of their power. So almost all human non-robot governments can't be completely based on violence or even completely based on power. They usually need some combination of them. And that puts a limit onto how much violence they can use. But violence is, you know, the willingness to use implements of technology to lay waste to power and strength across society, so that a single sovereign can implement their will.
But so violence can be related more to work, for instance, to the concept of work we discussed it before?
Well, it's related to work in the sense that work produces the implements of violence, right? The technologies of violence. I mean, violence usually uses bows and arrows or guns or bombs or, you know, whatever the most advanced tools it has. But I don't think it itself is a work. It's, I don't think she sees violence as work. I don't know why we would say that.
Or a strength to labor, for instance, to the body, the strength of the body, or it's nothing. It's more.
I don't think strength or violence are connected. I think strength can be. You could also have strength of mind, which is an independence of mind. I'm not sure why we would connect it to the body. I mean, yes, our typical example is the sort of muscle-bound person, but you can be strong of mind and in your independence. I don't think strength.
Is the distinction, maybe the reason people are making this distinction is that, in a sense, that it's not really public in the sense that nothing's being debated. You're just kind of pushing people out of the way without actually having any sort of dialogue.
Yeah, okay. But I mean, that's true for both violence and strength. I don't think these map on to work or labor in the ways that you're suggesting, Aldous. I don't know. But I don't see that. Okay. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to write me with a further question, you can. I just don't quite understand it yet. All right, Dina.
Just to that last point, I do want to add that she does discuss the extraction of material from the earth in terms of a certain type of violence, and the imposition by Homo faber of form onto material as a certain form of violence. Right. I don't know if that's what Aldo meant, but she does consider it in that context. I also just wanted to add something to the jury discussion before asking my question, which is that in the United States, at least in the criminal context, the jury is charged not to consider sentencing and therefore revenge, but is actually identified as the arbiter of what happened and who did it. And so in that sense, the jury is really a a, 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 not in the meaning of a common logic, but in the meaning of a common perception, a common making of reality. And my question, I don't know what you think about that, but it's really its role when the jury is assembled in a criminal trial to ascertain what happened or what was presented to them.
So if you, I'll just respond briefly if you want. I mean,
sure.
Yes, today, the jury in its origins and in its common law foundations, this separation of fact and law, which we put on the jury today, so that the jury is the trier of fact, the judge is the trier of law, was not original to the jury. And the jury was simply spoke a verdict, a saying of justice. And that would include both fact and law. One of the most controversial holdovers of that is what's called jury nullification. So the idea that even though the judge will tell the jury, your job is not to decide if what the law is, it's simply to say whether the facts fit the law, we still permit the jury to, in a sense, reject the judge's interpretation of the law and declare someone not guilty through a nullification. And, to me, back to the other comment, I mean, that's one of the most important rights of the citizen in a jury. One of the reasons I've never been able to get on a jury is that I've written about this, and when they ask me, questions in voir dire, I always have to say, well, I'm in favor of jury nullification, and that doesn't usually sit well with the judges. I actually had one judge call me to his quarters and said, "You're not going to be on this jury, but I actually want to hear your arguments." And we'd had a half-hour conversation about jury nullification, but they're never going to let me on a jury, and that's too bad, because I actually really believe being on a jury is one of the most important aspects of being a citizen in this country. Go ahead, Dina.
Can I just say that many years ago, when I was on a jury, I guess my disenchantment, or perhaps it made me very angry, that at the very, very end, just before the judge passed sentence, he laid out all the facts of the situation that had not been put before us in case they would prejudice us one way or the other. And I guess I felt that control of information, that I think that angered me very much, that control of information. And it's true that it might have persuaded or influenced some people, but still, what about that control of information?
Yeah, we'll come back to that. We're almost out of time, though, and I want to get to these last few questions. Dina?
So I was wondering what political action and speech actually is about, other than about itself, other than about promoting and preserving the conditions of making politics possible. So in other words, how is the content of political action created in the course of performance, when the performance is the end in itself? And relatedly, how, if at all, do the minimum conditions necessary for action relate to the equal access to the public realm, or are these two separate issues entirely?
This is a question that we've come up against a lot. It's another version of the question of, well, okay, Hannah Arendt, you think politics is important, but you don't think the social question is important. What do we talk about when we talk about politics?
I'm just trying to ask it a little differently, in the sense that if Arendt's conception promotes a plurality of viewpoints, and that this plurality of viewpoints is what politics is about, does it in effect level the contents of the views, because the content of the views is actually immaterial vis-a-vis the promotion and preservation of the plurality of viewpoints?
Does it level the content of the views?
because
think
the
what he's trying to ask is
plurality of the
like
viewpoints is
QAnon being on the level of like the CDC. Like, in other words, having a plurality of views could lead to all views being treated as equal or something like that, even though some of them are bunk.
Dina, did you want to say something else?
I didn't understand Hal's point. I didn't hear it properly.
It's all right. Go ahead.
Yeah.
He said that it's basically the equalization of the QAnon view with the Biden view, right?
Or like the CDC, or like something that's like supposed like scientific or whatever. Maybe the CDC isn't a good example, but like basically objective reality versus total conspiracy theory.
No, the question doesn't go to an evaluation of these the views themselves. I'm just wondering if if the plurality of viewpoints is always primordial and more is really the focus of political action. Does that in effect not level the content of the viewpoint?
It does to some degree. I mean, again, the context of this is the being of individuals, the appearing and being of individuals, and to the extent that what matters is not the aim or the motivation or the good or evil, but the sort of goodness of the glorious perfection and virtuosity of how they speak and act in ways that are memorable and meaningful. The content in that regard is less important, I think. That said,
I don't understand how we distinguish ourselves if we're all just a bunch of beautiful butterflies flying about.
I was going to say, that said, the content will matter to some degree, in how you're going to be remembered. Some people will be remembered as perfect criminals, and some people will be remembered as perfect heroes. And on that level, the content does matter. If you and to some degree, if you say stuff that nobody is interested in, you won't be that remembered. And you won't have stories told about you. To be there is, I mean, this is why, to go back to what we were talking about way back, this is why reality matters, right? To also bring up, to respond to Hal's question, there's a certain sense in which if you ignore reality, then you also lose the ability to matter as well. Where did she talk about this? I know I talked about it today, but it's on page 208. The only character of the world by which to gauge its reality is its being common to us all. And common sense occupies such a high rank in the hierarchy of political qualities because it is the one sense that fits into reality as a whole, our 5 strictly individual senses. And just above this, she's talking about the Dante quote again that we talked about last week, that nothing acts, but by acting, it makes patent its latent self. Action calls who we are into full existence, but it can only call who we are into full existence if people attend to it, and they're only going to attend to it to so a large degree if we speak to reality. And so that's supposed to be the limit, right? And and then if Hal says, well, then how come QAnon? Well, people have had conspiracy theories all the time. They're usually excluded from most of the public. why now are they being included? And how does one address that is I think the right question. But from Arendt's point of view, the need to conform to or engage with reality is part of the criteria for action. Because if you don't engage with reality, people are going to ignore you.
The other element, of course, that she focuses on is Achilles and an insistence that you essentially have to die for the sake of your self-disclosure in the public realm.
That's
you have to go that far to be seen, or at least be willing to go that far to be seen.
Well, if you want to guarantee that you'll be seen in the way you want to be seen.
Right.
Right. We'll do the last question will be Vigdis.
Yes, I'm actually going to the last part Robert had, but in a bit quite other, so another aspect of it that touches more on to what Catherine said earlier. Is this perhaps nothing in our history has been so short-lived, a trust in power? Nothing more lasting than the Platonic and Christian distrust of the splendor attending its space of appearance. Nothing, finally, in the modern age, more common than the conviction that power corrupts. And what I am a bit puzzled with is when this last part, because I think when people talk about power corrupts today, they don't talk about power in the sense that Arendt talks about power. She gives her definition in contrast to how it's used very oftenly, I think. And at least if I'm using power corrupts, have used it many times, but I've never thought of power in the sense that Arendt defines it. And I think the way Arendt defines it makes a lot of sense. But I think that when we talk about today power corrupts, we talk about like, you see it with Putin, you see it with Erdogan, you see it with Netanyahu, you see it in these men who sits on power and sits forever. That's how we talk about power corrupts. And I'm a bit puzzled about how she puts it in here. That's what I
think there's a very simple answer to it to some degree, Vigdis, which is that she's worried, and that the general truism power corrupts leads, which is of course true, right? I mean, no one's going to deny that power can corrupt in cases like you described and in many other cases. But if you accept it as a truism, it leads to the idea that in politics, the effort has to be to limit power. And if you look what's happened in the United States, our constitutional tradition has come to see the Supreme Court as an attempt to limit power, right? We see the Constitution now as basically a no-saying thing. You're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do this, judicial review. Whereas from Arendt's point of view, the original point of the United States Constitution was a constitution of enumerated powers. It was what you could do and what you couldn't do. And the turn away from thinking about power as a good thing to just thinking about we want to learn how to limit power ignores the importance of power in her sense. And so what she's arguing against is an entire political theory tradition and a historical tradition, starting with Plato, which basically says we can't trust power. And so we should do everything we can to neuter it and limit it. And she's like, oh, of course you can't trust power. That's obvious. Power corrupts. But it's not option of power, and the dangers of power is not neutering it, it's dispersing it. So that's the argument she's making. And if you think that power is always bad and always corrupts, you don't ever make the argument we should expand it. And she wants to make the argument we should expand it.
Yes, I will agree about that, but I also see this, like Catherine said, it makes it very difficult to discuss power with other people because you don't, and this is the problem I see very often. People have different concepts of the same word. And that seems to be quite troubling because you have to define what Arendt means by with her concept of power.
I will. I know, but the one thing I'll say for Arendt is that she defines her concepts by power, and she defines.
Yes, she does. She does. But if you talk about it with other people, you always have to remember that. I think you can't just go on and talk with other people without defining it in the actual discussion.
That's true. You know.
And I think that's a problem many times. People talk about different things. They discuss. They have one word, but they discuss actually from different concepts. So that was my main point here.
I think you're right. Thank you. We're over time, so I'm gonna have to. I know there was one more question, but Alex, I'm sorry. We'll come back to it next time. Great discussion. Thank you guys, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Thanks very much.